light to its shadow and figure out which models are in it. You're probably amazed to think that we used to light that way. We had a lot of control, but believe it or not, before cars, it was all lit through text editor. On the right there is a tool we have called Lumos that you'll probably find a little more familiar looking. It has an inspector, a browser, a viewport. We moved over to a UI-based system. And what I'm going to show you now is sort of what that tool looked like and what sort of controls we have over the lighting in this era of Lumos, which is cars to bridge. And note that this is given by a non-lighter. I don't light professionally. So there are a lot of details I don't necessarily know about this, but I'll do my best to sort of explain what we have. So again, it's a sort of traditional sort of browser-based UI, and that we have a scene graph on the left, viewers in the front, and an inspector on the right. We often divide our lights into groups or types of light. Pre-illums, illums, post-illums, trace components and shading components. And we have these to give sort of maximum control to the lighter. So pre-illum is a light that can affect the surface before you've actually put any lights in the scene. So let's say you just want a surface to be blue on it before any light hits it. You can kind of do that in a pre-illum. So it's sort of like a cheat that is given to the light. Illums are what most people think of as lights. That is a point light, rectangular light, gummy light, line light, a whole bunch of different lights, scatter lights, and so on. So those are our more traditional light sources. After those, we can put on a post-illum, which affects the color after, believe it or not, after the light has run. So things like after the light is on, change the saturation, for instance, or add some murk. So we can change the color before the light, when the light runs, and after the light runs. Now note, the power of these are on where these effects apply, and those are called components. And I'll get to that later. But just in terms of how to set the color, we have three ways so far. Pre-illums, illums, and post-illums. We also have a trace illum, which sort of separates out which parts of the lighting require ray tracing. So we have things like a trace planar, which traces a particular plane, things like environment lights. Also, we have that technique I showed you earlier, trace radiance, where you make the world into a 3D texture and then do a blur lookup. That's a component, trace radiance, versus trace ray trace. Then we have trace cube, so a bunch of different ray tracing components. Then we have another type of light, which is very odd. We call it a shader driver. It's a light that actually can change the parameters of a material based on where it's shining. So this is a scene in Up, where the light, the shader driver light, is shining on the base of the tree. And that is telling the shader to grow more moss, to have more green in there. Which is very odd, but it's a way for us to sort of, the shader TV might shade a particular object, but someone might move a tree around or move a rock. And lighters can actually use lights to sort of influence the effect of the shading. It's a very odd system. I don't know many other studios that are doing this. But it's definitely a way of sort of giving lighters more control. Speaking of control, what we often do is in each light, we group with it a bunch of components. These are components that can affect where the light applies and what the color is through different sorts of UIs. One is called the colorer, and you can do things like change the color of a light based on distance. So you can see on the bottom left, that's like a distance colorer. So in the front it might be red, in the middle green, in the back blue. Very common way to color a light source. Another one is sort of does it based on the angle between the light ray and the light direction. So you sort of red in the center of the light, green sort of away, and blue for farther than that. We use an image file. It's often called a cookie or a gobo. And then we have a radial one where we can, that last one is actually called a rod, which is very odd. Rather than the coloring being at the origin of the light or based on the angle, it's actually a sphere in the scene that we can place around that can color. the light source. So you can almost think of it as like a 3D paintbrush. If anything, you have used a volume light in Maya. It's just a sphere or a very simple shape that can kind of color everything in the center of it based on a specific color. That's sort of what a color rod is. It's like a volume light in Maya. So you can use that to sort of 3D paint the scene. Similarly, we have a bunch of shadows. We have occlusion, reflection occlusion, which is a way of computing reflection based on reflection occlusion for darkening environment maps. And then we have just regular ray tracing shadow maps, but also things like a fake shadow. That's just like a simple shape that we can set up. Actually, we have a bunch of shadowing components. Then shapers, things like barn doors, cut on, cut off, which gives you a narrow band of light. So like, anything over 100 meters and below 500 meters, where the light goes. As a way we have of shaping it. We have some penumbra things, and we have some diffuse roll-off, where we can actually have the diffuse be sharper or wrap around a little. Oops. Sorry. I'm just going to ask to show me to do that. So we have a bunch of shaper components. Barn doors and go-go's are very common, as well as other things that use environment shapes to sort of splat colorly radially, or what we call a linear rod, which is a line that can influence color in the scene. So we have lots and lots of different ways to shape the lighting. And we often do it on a per character basis, believe it or not. So here's an example of what the character rig of lights might look like for the character Carl on Hub. We'll start with a key light. And this is common lighting technique where, it's the dominant source, sun, moon, typically coming, from a certain direction. And that, as you can see in the light browser on the right, will have a number of components, like occlusion or shadows and so on. So we have a key light, we have a fill light. A fill light is typically usually coming from sort of the opposite direction, it's very soft, typically shadowed by occlusion. So normally, with the key light, you use either a shadow map or ray trace shadow to darken it. A fill light, which can often be an environment light, you often want to shadow with occlusion. So for a key light, you might have different components for these. A bounce light, similar to fill, but we use it, but rather than from a discrete light, it's usually from other surfaces. You can think of that as color bleeding. Rim light, we almost always have a light behind the character, even when it makes no sense, like theatrical lighting. Whenever you see, Arnold Schwarzenegger or something on the screen in Terminator, inexplicably there's a rim light behind him to give him a wonderful, shape. The same thing with our characters. We always love to have a rim light around there, especially with hair, ears, gives you a nice backlighting effect. So, usually it's more subtle than what we see here, but that's always part of our character group. Environment light, we always, for our reflective materials, have a bit of environment on the objects. And then scatter light. This is just the translucent surfaces. We often have very specific controls just for them. Oh, and an irradiance light. I thought the fill light was color bleeding. Apparently that was a different light. Irradiance light. This is color bleeding. And that you can see looks very odd, but that's just the bounce light, independent of the direct light on Carl. Now, we get even more detailed. Let's zoom in. The eyes are a lighting rig unto themselves. So much of the character's acting comes through the eyes. So it's something you really need to think about. So often we have these little rectangles. We call them trace frames.